Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 24 of the Lodgge Podcast. I am your host, Scott Milley, and joining me today is my unique Talca guest, Steve Vegvari. Steve, how are you doing today?
I'm doing really well. Thank you so much for inviting me onto the show. I feel like it's been a long time coming. We've crossed paths many times, but this is a great opportunity to sit down and kind of discuss Canadian games, the Canadian game scene. It's going to be fun.
It's something that I think you and me have talked about for a long time. Again, we're just kind of passing quickly at all these different events saying, we need to do something. We need to work together. We need to find time. And then now, right before GDC, this is something that I really wanted to get into with you. So for those who aren't aware, Steve is a leading voice in the Canadian video game media scene. He's a podcast host. He's a seasoned writer with over 8 years of experience covering all things video games and interactive entertainment. He's joining me today to talk about covering games in Canada, what studios can do to better work with local press, what makes the Ontario video game industry unique and exciting, and much more. So without further ado, let's get into the conversation. Steve, first question I got to ask you. I always have a different opening question for every season of the show, and this is one that I've really enjoyed, and I'm looking forward to getting your answer. So, in 2024, what was your gaming resolution? Are you trying to play more games? Is there a franchise that you missed out on that you're trying to catch up on? Maybe even taking a bit of a break. I know it's a little bit harder in your position, but is there anything that you're trying to achieve this year?
That's actually a great question, and I'm not really sure if I have one. I think if anything, it would be to complete more games. Only because last year, I mean, one of the best years in video games ever for all intents and purposes. But one of the like the most glaring omissions was I never found time to play through and beat Baldur's Gate 3. And that always just kicked me. As someone who grew up a huge Baldur's Gate fan, I was
Mm-hmm.
like, I gotta get to this game. I gotta get to this game. And it never happened. So this year I've been kind of trying to prioritize, kind of draw myself a roadmap of okay, Final Fantasy Rebirth is coming out this week. Then we got the list goes on, and every single time that there's like a new presentation or something going on, I'm like, okay, here's another game. I'm trying to just be more organized in that way, so that I'm not just missing something that a game that should be near and dear to me.
I feel like there's a lot of people that have had that same struggle, especially with Baldur's Gate. Like
Yeah,
it's just such a an acclaimed title, right? And like I love it. I've played it. But it was one of those games that like I'm now trying to start scheduling my time. I'm doing the same thing as you, and I have a bunch of buddies that mock me for it because I'm like, oh, when are you gonna get on Helldivers? I'm like, April 17th. I'm like, I'll
right.
jump in with you. I'm like, because I want to finish this by this time, this by this time. And for me with Baldur's Gate, I didn't have it on my roadmap. I was like, oh, it's not going to be for me. I do love RPGs, but I was never a fan of the franchise growing up. I didn't know too much about it, and then it just came out and just took over. I
Oh
was
my
like,
god, yeah.
oh, I need to pay attention. And then as soon as I jumped in, I was like, oh, this game is exactly for me. This is
Yep.
exactly what I want in my life. But yeah, I feel you on that. I'm also trying to be more organized, putting together, Notion template of like, these are the games that I need to play. These are the games that I'm currently playing. What do I need to finish? And then stop going back to old games that I've beaten that are just like comfort food. Do you have any of
Exactly.
those? Any of the ones
I,
where you're like, ooh, I
oh,
really should be
tons.
playing new things, but I can't stop going back to this one from 15 years ago?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I grew up like a Halo kid, so all every single year I have the itch to be like, okay, do I go back through the entire franchise? Just, whether it's online or just the campaign. So I always have to like put a pin in it and be like, okay, maybe later, but later never comes.
I'm very blessed in that situation. Is my sister, she's been a gamer, but never really first person shooters or really too involved. She got an Xbox Series S
Yep.
and she wanted to play through the Halo games. So I have that excuse right now. I just
Yep.
finished one. We're starting to
Oh,
I'm the same as you. I have that itch every year. And she's like, play them. It's like, yes, like this is the excuse I needed. I've always
yeah,
wanted
I
to play
need that
through with them.
excuse. I need that excuse. Yes.
Need someone to, yes, I'll bring you for the first time. It's like, you don't need to worry about that. Don't get too involved in the lore. Don't think too hard about it.
Exactly.
Like
Yeah, yeah,
it's
yeah.
just a fun time. So I wanted to get into the writing that you've been doing. You've been writing in this industry for again 8 years. I'm sure you've been writing longer than that when it comes to writing video games and things you care about. You've got the writing chops to cover all types of different digital media, right? I see you reviewing movies and I follow you on social, right? So I'm seeing all your different opinions and takes on all these different types of entertainment. What is it about the video game industry that keeps you so dedicated and so committed? I know it's not easy for Canadian press. So what is it that keeps you constantly coming back saying, you know what, video games is what I want to be talking about?
No, you're absolutely right. It definitely isn't easy, and I think a lot of colleagues or anyone else that's in the Canadian media side will definitely feel that way. It feels like an uphill battle, but to be totally honest, I think that kind of plays into it all. Is that yeah, I have been doing this for 8 years. I think granted, throughout the pandemic, I felt very fortunate in that I was getting more opportunities here and there. I was able to kind of expand my portfolio in terms of what I was doing and where I was kind of writing or even doing like hosting gigs and stuff like that. But now coming out of the pandemic, I think that a lot of companies now are tightening their budgets, tightening up their wallets and everything. So it feels even harder to not only continue what I'm doing, but continue it with the same kind of reverence or platform, as it were. So that being said, I feel like I have this kind of I don't know, it almost feels like bullish of me to say, but like I've invested so much time now, I have to keep going. I have to keep delivering the message. I have to keep covering it the way I have been all these years. But it all boils down to it's the passion, right? I think that the same reason I'm here is the same reason you're here. We love video games. It's an enticing medium. It's something that cannot be replicated, whether or not you look at movies, television, music, books, any kind of form of entertainment. It just cannot be replicated the same way that video games are. And someone who grew up with video games, it never it almost felt like Hollywood eyes where you'd see, Victor Lucas doing EP or, like
Yeah.
even G4 and everything, and you're like, "That's a Hollywood thing. That could never be me, someone who grew up in Guelph, Ontario." I was like, I'd have to go to LA to do any of this, to write about video games, to cover video games in any meaningful way, and lo and behold, I didn't. I just had to move to Toronto, an hour and a half away. But, yeah, now that it's been obtained, now that it's kind of been in my grasp, I feel like this ownership over it where I just have to keep doing it no matter the struggles or no matter the speed bumps along the way. It feels I feel ingrained in the Canadian media press right now as far as, like, the video game coverage, so I feel like at that point, you can't let it go.
There's a question I was going to get to a little bit later, but I think it fits in perfectly here.
Yeah.
Do you and your peers, right, Steve and Caboose and like the whole squad, do you guys feel like an obligation to be promoting Canadian slash Ontario games, even if it's not part of a paying job? You haven't, been working with this studio. You just see this great game and it's something that you really want to cover and make sure that you're talking about on the podcast. Do you feel like obligated to do so?
Yes and no. I feel like it's a subconscious obligation where I
Mhm.
again, it feels so near and dear to my heart, because it's right in my backyard. Like we're Ontario is home to so many great creators, voices, talented people as well, musicians that play into the Canadian game development. That I almost it doesn't feel like an obligation. It feels more like a desire, where it's like, well, if I have a platform to show off or talk about any of these games that are coming from Toronto, Ontario, even Canada as a whole, I
Yeah,
want
yeah.
to just have that that tack note at the end where it's like, "Okay, this is a really cool game, and did you know it came from Studio MDHR, which was founded in Oakville?" Or, you know,
Right?
or
That blew my mind when I found that out.
exactly,
Yeah.
or when, Sony, acquired Haven Studio, it's like, "Oh, PlayStation has its very first Canadian studio. Why aren't we talking about that more? That's a very interesting story." And so it's not so much an obligation, but it really does feel like I have to be proud of the games coming out of, Ontario and Canada, so why not use any kind of platform that I have to kind of spotlight these creators? Because to be honest, otherwise they're just going to be lumped into this like global sum of creators and game developers. Let's make them a little more special by saying, no, they're from here.
I
They're
remember it
they're
was
they're
yeah,
part of
please.
our roots, you know?
Yeah, no, I honestly I couldn't agree more. And that was something for me when I started with so for those who aren't aware, the lodge is run by Interactive Ontario and of course our dear friends at Continue. But I remember first coming into the industry and working with Ontario studios and being like, okay, this is going to kind of limit the scope of the games that I can talk about, or games that we're promoting. And then when you start finding and realizing the types of studios that are here, it's like we are spoiled with choice. Right, we have Digital Extremes, Warframe, one of the biggest games in the world, is right here. We have Drinkbox Studios, Guacamelee, one of the most acclaimed indies of all time, right? Like right now, Chivalry 2, Torn Banner. Like there's so many, and I know that there's thousands that I'm omitting right now, and I apologize for that. But it is something that it's right there, and it's so easy and it's so fun to promote. And then when you get to see things like with this podcast is being recorded before GDC, but you will be seeing it afterwards. But at GDC, the 7 out of the 8 winners of the best in play competition at GDC are from Ontario. 7 out of 8 globally are from the province. And it's mind blowing. And it's so fun to be able to share that information with people and not just say, oh, hey, make sure you're paying attention to us. And it's like, we have the games, we have the talent. It's fun and it's easy to pick, this amazing game. Coco Cucumber, Echo Generation and Ravenlock were made right here. Like,
Yeah.
it's really fun to find that stuff out and be able to share that with like friends of mine and other people that are into video games or maybe a little bit on the outskirts. And I'm like, oh, that game you love so much? That's made down the street. And it's like that yeah, it gives that kind of like sense of ownership almost where it's like, yeah, I love being able to champion the country and they just make it so easy by making all these great games.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's so funny because on paper, it almost feels like it would be a struggle, like you kind of alluded to, where maybe someone who's not familiar with a lot of studios could be challenged to be like, okay, name me your top 5 Ontario studios or
Yeah.
Canadian studios. But then once you actually, if you have a page in front of you and you start listing off all of them, you're just like, oh, no, never mind. It's super
It's
easy.
super easy. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's like, oh, I've played way more of these games than I realized.
Yeah.
So you've been doing this for almost a decade, and I want to kind of take it back to the start with this question. So, what was the first writing gig that really made you feel like this was going to be your future career? Obviously, you loved video games your whole life, and you
Mhm.
started getting into the industry and you started writing. And I'm sure you did a few pieces before you really felt like, you know what, this is what I want to do. This wasn't something on the side. This wasn't a passion. What was the first gig where you were like, this is so cool?
Yeah, I mean, I think like anyone kind of trying to start out in this industry, you always start with like the personal blog site or the enthusiast sites and stuff like that, kind of get your you know, your feet wet in a way. But it wasn't until I started working with Cineplex's now defunct subsidiary World Gaming, it was like their esports branch that kind of came to Canada and theaters. It wasn't until I started doing freelance writing for them that I was like, "Oh, this is exactly what I like doing." Part of my beat there was interviewing esports, like up and coming esports players that were making their big break in Ontario and Canada, and it was being able to tell their stories. These 16, 17-year-old kids who had just started playing Call of Duty or, Fortnite professionally and talking to them and be like, so listing off like a whole bunch of questions similar to what we're doing here and just kind of seeing that, oh, they've never done this before. They've never sat in on an interview before. And it is very special to kind of get those stories out and kind of help them like carve their own way. And then my writing gig started getting more broad outside of esports, but it was that was the precipice of like being able to tell stories of people who might not have had the chance otherwise. And that was when I was like, this is very, very special.
Was those relationships that you were building and kind of the tone in which you carried yourself in those conversations of kind of trying to, lead people rather than, asking these seasoned veterans and professionals, did that kind of help you come to the conclusion that you wanted to be more on camera? You wanted like you felt like that being able to have that one-on-one with people and be able to kind of build that rapport and that back and forth, did that kind of lead into you wanting to do podcasting and doing more, front-facing things like that?
Not at the time, only because again, these players, they were so fresh and new. It wasn't a conversation like this. Usually it would be over just the phone or something like that. They weren't set up in any way to have like a quote unquote a production like
I got you.
this
Yeah.
of even sitting on a Zoom call or anything like that. That came. down the line. That came years after writing and everything, and then kind of seeing where the industry was kind of going. This was even before like the advent of TikTok, where it was
Yeah.
I'm already like video game coverage, like writing about video games, it's already such a niche thing. It's specifically in Canada where we were already talking about how it's so difficult
Mhm.
to be in this bubble. So it kind of dawned on me to why not set myself up the best way possible to kind of give myself an advantage in the market of like, okay, well, I can write. Can I sit in front of a camera? Can I interact with other people? Can I host anything? Like, can I keep a conversation going? So that's kind of where that embryonic thought kind of exploded and bloomed, where it just came out of a need of necessity to do as much as I could within this industry and keep myself as finely tuned as I could, not only on the writing side, but just being a well-oiled machine in terms of like all these different facets. And then of course, now we're seeing how explosive it is on TikTok and Instagram Reels. So being able to talk to a camera, keep content going in a certain way, I think definitely helped out.
So yeah, that wasn't something that you were like, you know what, I want to be on camera, or I feel like I'm
Never.
gonna be, yeah, like I definitely feel you on that one. It just kind of falls into it. But I think for you, and especially like with the podcast, for the gaming podcast and all the other stuff that you're on, there's a sense of genuineness that I think is really, really, you can't fake it, right? And it's something that like say it all the time that like gamers can smell bullshit a mile away, right? Like, and that is one thing of this industry that I actually really love. And they will call you out on your shit, and they will make sure that people are staying honest. Obviously, there is 98% of the other stuff of the industry that I'm not always a fan of, and some of the conversation and hyperbolicness and all that stuff. But there is a sense of you go to the podcasts like the ones that you're on for that genuine take from people, right?
Right.
And there's a sense of pride, and there's a sense of ownership, and there's a sense of obligation to the community and to the audience, as well as to the devs, right? You want to make sure that they feel respected, and they feel seen, and they feel heard, but you also want to make sure that you're having like a strong critical opinion and an honest opinion on their games, to make sure that you still come off, as genuine as possible, because there will always be people that think that all journalists are just paid off to promote things
Yep.
well, and it's like that narrative's never going to go away no matter what we do.
No, of course not.
Um,
Although, I would love to exist in a world where Microsoft would dump loads of money on into my backyard, but that never happens, unfortunately. But no, that's so true though. I think that there is a genuine and earnest importance to having those conversations where you can put yourself out as like a critical mind, but also being totally fair and totally reasonable in your objections of
yeah,
a
I think
certain
that's a big part of it too. Yeah.
game aspect or a certain opinion that happens in the industry. I think a lot of them are happening right now as we're speaking, but I
Mhm.
think having those conversations and keeping them as honest as possible, not only within, the confines of a podcast between the host, but to the audience as well. I think I do sense a lot of need and importance with that. Of like, okay, if you're coming to me for the content, then I got to lean on you and just give you as much of an authentic representation of who I am as possible, and hopefully that resonates with the audience. And I mean, so far it has. I'm thankful for that.
So one of the things I definitely wanted to get into is that this podcast is usually right. We have the devs on, right? We're talking to Snowden, we're talking to Massive Damage, Digital Extremes. Like we've been able to talk to some amazing people. The
Yeah.
one angle that I've always wanted to be able to talk to, and you were a no brainer for this, was games media. So there's a ton of people, and this is how I wanted to start as well, that want to get involved in games, that want to be talking about it, and want to be, being able to share their passion with the world, but may not be interested in the development side of things. So the fact that you took that journalistic route, I was curious. We definitely have a number of listeners that are interested in just the industry itself. They're not interested in learning how to make the games. They want to enjoy their favorite hobby with the people that they care about.
Mhm.
So, do you have any tips and tricks on maybe how to get involved in the industry, writing articles, long, short form content? What would be your, top couple of tips for people looking to get involved in this space?
I love this because I think that there's such a conversation behind this question. Yeah, kind of what you alluded to. I grew up as someone, obviously love video games, but I never really found myself curious about how to make a video game, like the development side. I was
Mhm.
more curious about like who makes them. I was always,
Yes.
growing up, you always see like the Ubisoft symbol at the start of a game and everything. And as a kid, it never really clicked on me that that was a tangible company with humans
Humans
working.
behind it. Yeah.
Exactly. And at a
Yep.
certain point, you just, at least for me, just become genuinely curious. You're like, Okay, who is Bungie? Who is making Halo? Let's find
100%.
out more about them. Oh, they made this marathon game that except like the
The
list
whole
can
other
go on.
podcast.
Exactly, exactly. So going back to your question, yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways that you can kind of approach it. I think depending on who you talk to, a lot of people will say, "Oh, it has to do with, X percentage of skill and X percentage and a small amount of luck and everything." I call BS on that entirely. I think it's 90% luck and then the 10% of having the skill to back yourself up when you're in the right place at the right time. I think you can be the best writer, you can be the best host and everything, but unless you stumble into the right connections or stumble into the right opportunity, unfortunately, it's just such a competitive industry right now that everyone has the desire to get into it, and then also it's super accessible to just start doing it on your own. So I think for anyone that's out there that is genuinely interested to get into the press side or the hosting side, I just say one, start doing it now. Do whatever you can to be bad at it because I lament ever going back to, like, my first articles or the first opinion pieces I ever put out there because 'cause I'm sure that they're genuinely bad. I can't bring myself to do it, but I'm just gonna in my brain, I know, but I think it's really important to just start doing it so you can shake off those bad habits, you can start honing your craft. If you wanna start a podcast, get a couple friends. You don't need, like, the full setup with the stupid lights that I have up and everything. No, you just
I,
have to
I feel
just
you.
start doing it and have fun with it. And eventually you're going to build the confidence and build the skill set so that when you uh, cross paths with someone who can provide you with an opportunity, you have that resume, you have that backlog of content out there to be like, "Oh no, I've been doing it for 2 years. Why don't we partner up and do something?" So I do think that it's all that. And the other one that I highly encourage everyone take to heart is that if you are thinking about getting into the press side, getting into the review side, don't just play games that you love because I think
Yeah. Good advice.
one of the biggest things that I learned over my career is that it's super easy to critique and wax poetic about a game that you love. If it's, the new Fallout game that's coming out, I can go on and on for 3,000 words about why I love a game. But one of the most difficult challenges for me was talking about Fire Emblem Three Houses. I don't like turn-based RPGs at all. So talking about a game that doesn't resonate with me, I think it's so hard to exemplify and describe why a game doesn't resonate with you than it is to just go off for 10 minutes and say, oh, this game is great because of course it is because it's a game for me.
You're just letting the passion shine through, and like that's
Exactly.
much much easier, yeah, than being
Yeah.
like constructively critical on something.
Exactly.
I feel personally wounded about Three Houses, but
I'm
I'll let
sorry.
that go. I'm the same as you. Most turn-based combat isn't for me, except for Persona, and a few other major ones. But no, I feel you on that one, and I know that that's something that a lot of people don't want to necessarily hear.
I
But as I
know.
remember talking to a buddy from Xbox at Migs, I believe it was, definitely not attributed to me, but it was like preparation plus timing equals opportunity. So it's like like write your articles, record your podcast, get 5 views, get 10 views, get 20 views. That's fine, right? Like make sure that you're working on these skills, and then an opportunity will eventually show itself,
Right.
right? And as long as you keep moving, and I think another big important thing, which I think you guys and that the whole squad and you in particular, it's you have to build a brand for yourself, which is something that I don't think a lot of people are prepared for, especially as a freelance writer. So I'd love to hear a little bit of your comments on that of
Yep.
it's not just, oh, I write for this place and it's, oh, that's, that's mobile service piece. So that's their reputation. And then it's this piece. So it's their reputation. It's like, no, if it's coming from you, you as yourself. And I know a lot of people now, obviously with social media and TikTok and stuff, know that it's the face and it's their personality. But I don't think people are prepared for that going in, starting their career of like, no, you're building your name is a brand.
Yep. Yeah, I think, if we look back 10 years ago,
Hmm.
people went to IGN because it was IGN. Nowadays, people go to IGN for the specific voices. And I think that
Agreed.
that is across the board, whether or not you're looking at a website, a podcast, a TikTok channel. Everyone's looking for the voice, the brand, the personality. And I think right now it's so important, especially with AI on the forefront
Oh
and
man.
looming behind everyone. It's
Hmm.
so important to put your whole personality into everything you do, because that's the one thing that AI can't take and replicate right now is your personality. So why not take advantage of it? It's the one thing that makes you unique out there. So you might as well. So I do think that, yeah, it's important to build that brand, hone that brand, make your voice. It takes a while, but just keep at it. Just keep. I think it'll start to feel uncomfortable at first, but then you'll start feeling comfortable, and I think that's the natural progression of like, okay, this is how I want to be portrayed online. Whether people want to go in as deep as they want. Sometimes they up the ante or do it a little hyperbolically, but that's totally fine as long as you feel like that's a genuine representation of you online. The other thing that I think it springboards off of that is that, yeah, again, you're building your brand. So I do think that, well, there are some advantages of doing the whole, uh, right for this enthusiast website for the exposure, and that's what you're getting out of it. I do think that that is kind of a net loss these days, in that you're contributing to this other brand. You're not honing your own. So again, for people who are just starting out, I think that there's a lot of advantage to building your own brand, whether it's a website, a podcast, TikTok channel, anything like that, more so than going to X website that's just unable to pay you or pay you very less in exchange for this, you know, whole ghost or phantom that is known as exposure. Because I think that that is the value of exposure these days from a different website or anything like that is just dropping off a cliff at this point. You can get way more exposure on your own just doing your own thing.
Well said. And I think, yeah, something a lot of people should really take to heart. If you remember anything from this episode, take that to heart. Of yeah, go do it yourself.
Yeah.
And you'll feel a sense of ownership and you'll feel a sense of pride that you wouldn't
Oh
get
yeah.
otherwise. So one of the things I definitely wanted to get into during this conversation was media working with devs, right? So again, a lot of listeners that we have a lot of people that are looking to get into the industry or a lot of, seasoned veterans. And I love getting those messages and seeing people saying, "Hey, thank you for actually talking about some of the difficulties and some of the issues and some of the pain points." So one of the things that I did want to bring up with you is so big AAA studios, they have, the budget and they have the resources to get the coverage that they need for their big games, right? They have the billboards in LA, they have, they have their own showcases, right? They have that Microsoft money behind them, being able to get shown off on the world stage in that way. What is something that smaller devs can do to better work with you and your peers? Are there any like pain points or are there any things that you're like, yes, like please do that more often to make my life easier to cover your stuff? Therefore, you are getting exactly what you want.
Yeah, I think there's a number of things. First off, I can't imagine the difficulties that smaller studios have to go through these days. I was just reading the other day that I think in 2023 there were over 14,000 games that came to Steam, which,
Yes.
if you do the math, it boils down to almost 50 games a day. So
Mhm.
on the press side, we're struggling just to receive that information, receive like studios are struggling to get eyeballs on those games, and we're struggling to put our eyeball.
Dig
Yeah, we
through
don't.
and find what is quote unquote worth
Exactly.
talking about. They're all worth
So
talking about, but you know what I mean?
yeah, so I think that there's a number of things that smaller studios can do. The first and foremost is make sure that when like presenting their games, they're doing it in the most interesting or eye popping way possible. I get so many, pitch press releases and stuff like that, and immediately like certain studios, and not naming names out there,
No,
but
of course.
certain studios come out and they're like, okay, this is our new roguelite. And I'm like, but I I've seen how many roguelites come into my inbox.
Hmm.
That's not enough for me to genuinely get excited about your game. It has to be something, maybe a visual style, maybe it's just even how you're phrasing your pitches and your press releases. It could be something as simple as that, but I do think that inherently the description of your game is isn't as important as like that opening sentence or that first image that I see when I open your email. I think something like that goes way further than just like a broad description of saying this is a sci-fi action game. I'm like, I know those games. I've seen many of them. I'm well inundated with them. So I think it's just the messaging. The other thing that I think that a lot of Canadian studios, Ontario studios have to take advantage of is this idea of the community. The Canadian industry as a whole, whether we lump the developers and the press side in,
Hmm.
is that we're a tight knit community here. There's smaller in number. We're smaller in numbers than the U.S., the UK, a lot of other global markets. So take advantage of that. I think I see it from the press side. Everyone's willing to kind of leverage each other, support each other in the most dynamic ways possible. And I think studios could really use that to their advantage of just reaching out to Canadians because we're looking to support you as much as you're looking to for the support as well. So take advantage of community events that are happening, whether it's in Ontario, Montreal,
Hmm.
Vancouver, any of the major hotspots, because people come out in droves. They want to play games, they want to see games, they want to feel what the US feels, whether it's at Summer Games Fest or stuff like that. So I think if we're all on the same page and kind of supporting the same initiatives, I don't see why studios should have that much of a difficulty. But I do think that it is the going back to the initial point there is it's the problem of just getting that messaging across in an exciting way. So I think that's the biggest thing is think exciting. How do I leverage my game, which for all intents and purposes is probably very good. How do we get that in front of everyone and make them excited for it? I think that's the big hurdle, but I think there are a lot of ways. But take advantage of the fact that Canada is a smaller market.
Yeah, yeah, that's very again very well said. I think that that's a major thing that a lot of studios could benefit from. It is really fun to see some studios starting to kind of take that to heart, and you're starting to see a couple more like bundles, right? So I remember
Right.
seeing like it was like Phantom Compass and then a studio out of BC. They bundled their games together because they were friends and their games were similar. And then we got a couple more with I believe it was Black Tabby Games, right? And Slay the Princess, and they partnered with another studio. I don't want to get it wrong. Right. And like seeing those bundles of like, ooh, you have a game that's kind of similar to mine. Instead of looking at them as competition, it's like let's find a way to collaborate together. Let's
Right.
let's share each other's stuff. Let's point our niche audience that loves what we're doing towards yours and vice versa. Then everybody wins, right? And then you kind of see all these studios kind of raising together. And that's honestly one of my favorite things about being able to go to B2B events is really fun because you get to see the studios really spend time with each other
Yeah.
right there. Like I have a pitch with this publisher today. Do you have one tomorrow? Let's talk about it. Let's exchange notes. Like that's a blast. And then getting to see them at B2C, right? And being able to see them with consumers and they've kind of taken that advice from their peers and being able to kind of hone their craft during some of these other conferences and then bringing them and getting to share them with the press and share them with the world. And it's a unique point of pride for myself. And I know for a lot of Ontario that it is a very, very supportive community. It
Yes.
is there's not a whole lot of infighting, right? There's not a lot of oh
No.
yeah, there's not a lot of quote unquote competition with each other. Even if a
No.
studio is bigger or has more people or whatever metric you're using for success, every studio has a different metric. You have four people and you're making a game that you love and you guys are all able to pay your way. All the power to you, right? That's success to you. You don't need 50 people to have a successful studio. But yeah, like just to kind of bring it back to the point, I agree. There's something really great about having a community like that, and something we should try to leverage more and point towards press, right? Oh, hey, we have this great relationship. I know you love the game that I'm working on. Thank you for sharing it. have you seen this game? Have you seen this studio? And
Right.
like that, just having that in, right? Because I know you have relationships with, quite a few developers in
Mhm.
Ontario, but I'm sure that you would have even more if some of those devs were to kind of point you in those directions. Hey, pay attention to this studio. Hey, have you heard about this small team coming up? Stuff like
I
that.
yeah, I again, going back to that original point of how many games are coming out, I think even
Oh man.
for me on a day-to-day basis, it is hard to keep up with it all and know,
Mhm.
okay, this studio is releasing this game next month versus like Venba last year was a surprise to me when it first like popped up. I was like, "Oh my goodness." And it's
Wow.
made in Toronto, like, and it's a
Yep.
really good game. I wish I knew about that game months in advance so I could start, looking into it and hyping it up and stuff like that. And because it's a genuinely great game. But I
Nominated for
do think
like in the Game Awards,
yeah,
and yeah, just came out with DLC a couple days ago. Everybody go check that out. Yeah,
exactly, the
they're
recipe
they're they're
book.
great.
Yeah,
Yeah, the
absolutely.
recipe book.
Yeah, so I think also taking advantage of the great Ontario voices. I mean, I have the absolute pleasure of working with people like Brad Shankar, who does a phenomenal job elevating Ontario studios and games. The people over at Console Creatures as well, they do a really great
Mhm.
job. So I think, a certain amount of outreach, is definitely required on the studio's part, but I again, I totally understand how much of a struggle that must be, especially if you're working with constrained budgets and,
Yeah,
just a smaller window of time to even be able to do outreach. I can't imagine how demonstrably difficult that must be, but I just wish that want to encourage studios to continue just leveraging that collaborative, effort out there because I think that is really something special and it makes Canada stand out.
agreed. So I think one of the really cool things that you're able to do, right, is cover all different types of games, whether it's Canada or whether it's the States or wherever in the world. It's something that you're able to kind of share. This is a game I love. This is a game I'm interested in. This is a game I'm playing with my friends. Do you have any pieces, since this is a podcast and I want to make sure that you're getting your value? I want you to plug a piece or two involving your favorite Ontario or Canadian studio. Is there any article? Is there any piece? Is there any podcast that you would like to point the people towards where you were able to get into a little bit more detail about a game that you loved?
Not necessarily a piece, but I've waxed poetic about a game that we just talked about, or a studio that we talked about, which was Coco Cucumber, and everything that they've been doing, whether it's Echo Generations, and I think that they are one of the most talented studios in Ontario right now that's really elevating what Ontario games can even be. I hate to just single out one because I think that there are a lot of special ones, but their take on like voxel based animations and stuff like that. I've talked about it a lot on the Creature Cast, one of my
Mhm.
weekly podcasts. I encourage a lot of people go there for like weekly just updates on stuff on games that me and my co-hosts are playing. But yeah, they are one of I think Ontario's best, and I just want to again put another shout out. Whenever Drinkbox wants to drop their next game, I'm going to be there day one. I'm like on the calendar. We'll start marking days down whenever they announce Guacamole 3 or whatever have
Oh,
you. Like
who
I
knows? And it's
cannot wait.
It's something that's driving me nuts too, because like again, I'm lucky enough, and I feel very privileged to be in a position where I get to talk to some of these studios,
Yep.
and like I just want to press them and be like, "Can you just tell me? I won't tell anyone. I'll
Right.
sign an NDA. Please just
Yep.
let me know because it's not for any other reason other than I just want to know what they're making. I'm just so interested." We were lucky enough to have Graham Smith, one of the co-founders, on the podcast when Nobody Saves the World came out.
Oh,
And it was, yeah, being able to get that ended up being probably an hour and a half long episode, one of the longest ones, because I had him in the room. I just had to ask
of course.
Guacamelee legacy, and like there were so many questions that I needed to get into, not only just for our listeners, but personally.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's
No,
just so many cool
I had
studios.
the a great opportunity to go visit their studio a couple times when they were in development of Guacamole 2 and then Severed as well. And both
Yes,
times, like it's just so cool to see that team work and in their like natural habitat. So yeah, Graham's great. I've had the pleasure of speaking to him as well, and it's yeah. Anytime that they want to drop their next game, I'm here for it. I'll be there supporting it.
and we'll be covering it day one as well. So it seems to be obviously this people have been saying this for quite a while now, but obviously a lot of events kind of closed down and stopped during the pandemic, and it really feels like we're really hitting our stride now. It really seemed to start coming back 2023, 2024 is a really exciting year. We have, Toronto Games Week coming up, XP. We have a ton of great events that are kind of on the docket for this year. As a member of the press, I know you and me have talked about this a little bit off cam, but I would love to get your take. There are a ton of people that are organizing these events, that are planning these events out, and making sure that the devs have what they need, making sure that the attendees are, taken care of, things are organized, bills are paid. Press tends to come as one of the last things on the checklist of making sure that they're getting the proper coverage from the right talent. What is something that either an event coordinator or even a dev or someone who's looking to do something at one of these events, what are some of the opinions or some of the tips that you have for them to make, again, your life easier, therefore getting them the coverage that they so desperately want?
Yeah, again, I can't imagine how much coordination has to go through, whether it's event planners or the developers to even align what's going to be shown on the showroom floor or what kind of
Mhm.
panels are going to be there. But I think it all does come down to having that schedule or kind of that floor plan
Yeah, floor
ahead of
plan's a
time.
big one that
Yeah,
it's I know it's difficult, and I know some
of
places don't
course.
necessarily want to share it before
Yeah,
because tends to be, right, only, let's say, half of the floor is really booked and done 2 weeks before. So they're
right.
terrified to share that, and it's, "Oh, we're only half full." They'll fill up. It's
Yeah.
just devs don't have the time
Yeah, but
or
I
need
think
to.
that yeah, for the press, just feeding as much information ahead of time, being transparent, it goes so far to just for me being able to then start planning out. Okay, what developer is going to be there? What panel are they kind of a part of or hosting? And that way, I know what my coverage plan is going to be ahead of time. Because otherwise, there have been and unfortunately so many events recently in the past couple of years that I've just kind of gone in like it's the Wild West. Like I'm just gonna cover it as broadly as I can ahead of time and then go in and see what happens. I mean, I have no agenda, which is scary and is also a little
Mhm.
frustrating because you want to get those stories out there. You want to talk to as many developers as you can and hear their side of it here and see their games, get hands-on time with their games. But when you go in and it's kind of just spread shot of like, I guess I'm just cruising the showroom floor and whatever catches my eye. That's cool, and that can garner some organic excitement. But at the end of the day, I think having a more constructive baseline just for the press to come in and be like, okay, these are my like 3 games that I'm gonna hit. This is the panel I'm gonna go to. Afterwards, I'm gonna talk to this developer and hear from them. So, yeah, just a little more structure as much as possible. I think is the one constructive criticism that I can give any event planner or any developer that's attending some of these events this year or even next year.
Of yeah, just being able to kind of give you maybe a little bit more information beforehand. And
Yeah.
again, being able to be a part of, planning a fair share of my own events, I understand their struggle, right? Like I
Of
have a
course.
personal attachment. We've been able to, host some great events with Interactive Ontario and with others. That it's we know the back end of being like we're as planned out as we can be, but it's maybe yeah letting in a few members of the press, especially those once you've built those relationships that are trustworthy and respected. That it's here's a little bit of extra information. These are people you can look for, and that gives you a way to create additional content, being able to write a preview or being able to say, hey, this studio is going to be there next week. Make sure you come and check them out at this place. And it's like that's attention to the event, that's attention to the studio,
Yep.
that's coverage for you. And it's like everyone wins if you're able to write more content with more info.
Yeah, exactly. I think that might be an oversight is that, some event planners or anyone involved might not see the value of like what a preview piece can really bring. But
Mhm.
again, going back to this whole theme of excitement and driving excitement to the consumer or attendees, that there's a lot of power in that and just, previewing, an event and just saying, "Okay, this is what you can expect over these 3 days, this week-long event. Here's who's gonna be there. Here's when you need to be there as the attendee. Here's when you need to come attend this panel, listen to these developers as they talk about, making this game that you loved or, you know, starting up their next project or stuff like that, it's incredibly hard for me to drive excitement when I don't even know what's going on. I'm going in blind, but yeah. So having that. You brought up a really great point though, is that it doesn't have to be this wide thing where you put out the schedule online on a blog post or stuff like that. You can just lean on, trusted press members, and,
Mhm.
if you wanna keep it a contained story like that, I don't see why not just at least try to get that story out in some way.
Yeah, get some of that organic coverage beforehand, and I think that's one of the things with event planners, right? Is they're thinking ticket sales. As long as they have enough ticket sales, that's the metric they're looking at. But there
Right.
are other metrics to keep in mind, right? Again, I don't want to be speaking to some of those bigger events because again, I can only imagine how hard some of those are to
Of course.
plan. But being able to get some of that coverage and get people in, especially ones that aren't necessarily traditionally about video games. Video games are there, but it's
Mhm.
like I don't think a lot of those places realize the amount of people that would go to be able to get hands on with this new game or be able to see
Right.
what this studio is working on. Like specifically, you will get other ticket sales that you wouldn't normally get based on people wanting to go and get hands on with their favorite studio or with their this new upcoming game that could drive a lot of people towards your event.
Yeah, and I don't know what that says about how some of these event planners perceive the popularity of video games in Canada.
Yep,
Again, I think it goes into the whole story we're kinda talking about of, like, it being a smaller kind of niche bubble. But that being said, I do struggle to agree with that statement. I agree with you, though, Scott, in that I think that if they were to come out, be transparent with, attendees and even the press, and say, like, "Hey, this is what the floor plan looks like. These are who's gonna be on the showroom floor." That's gonna drive so much excitement, and again, that's gonna be seen in ticket sales, and at the end of the day, that's what they want.
agreed. So again, I really appreciate you coming out and taking the time to talk with us. I think that'll about do it for episode 24 of the Lodge Podcast. 24, it's crazy to me.
24. Congrats.
Uh, thank you. Steve, do you have any final words before we sign off for the day?
No, no, again, just thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me, invite me onto the show. It's an immense pleasure. I think the audience for listening in. I hope they enjoyed the conversation. But no, no, I'm just going to be kicking around the internet. I'm going to make it really easy for everyone to find me and find all my work. Uh, on every platform, I'm available at S Vegvari.
That was exactly my next question. You beat me right to it. I was going to say, where can the people find you online? You beat me to it. That's
I did
awesome.
it.
So again, thank you everyone for joining us. We know how valuable and precious your time is, and we appreciate you coming out and checking out the show. Thank you to Ontario Creates for your continued support of the podcast and the Lodge as a whole. And a special shout out to Continue for producing today's episode. We always appreciate you making us look good, sound good to the best of your abilities, of course. And finally, a big thank you to you, Steve. I know how busy you are, and I know how difficult it is with some of the jobs that you've got going on, freelancing, podcasting, being in 10 places at once, making sure everything's covered on socials. So I know how valuable your time is. And I really appreciate you coming out, talking to our audience.
Anytime.
Make sure to go check out his stories on Mobile Syrup, iPhone Canada, check out the podcast. But again, social media, he's got it covered. If you want to know anything that's going on in video games, interactive entertainment, keep your finger on the pulse. Check Steve's stuff out. So this episode, like I mentioned, is going to be is recorded right now before GDC, but will be posted afterwards. So hopefully you enjoyed all of the Lodge's coverage of GDC 2024. And if you missed any of it, make sure to go check out the site and go check out some of our socials to see some of the great coverage of Ontario studios. But until then, everybody, take care.